Hello everyone and welcome again to the Retrogaming Graveyard. I am your host Moze Howard and it's time for another retrospective on the video games of the past as they relate to more current role-playing games. In this, the first real season of the Retrogaming Graveyard, we're really going to be focusing on the more obscure console games that are forgotten, either because the property has been abandoned or the company that owned them went under. Now last time we went back to 1979 and did our best to ignore disco. This time around we're going forward a little bit so as to reflect on a title that is memorable indeed. You might have heard this name before. Tell me, does Dungeons & Dragons ring a bell? That's right, D&D, or rather AD&D, since this was during the period when there were two current editions of the venerable granddaddy of all RPGs available. You might be interested to know that this is the first official D&D video game and one of the few games released while D&D creator Gary Gygax was in control of TSR. The game was released in 1981 on the Mattel Intellivision. The Intellivision itself enjoyed a broad release in 1980 as Mattel entered into the video game market with an effort to shake the death grip held there by Atari's VCS console, again better known after 1980 as the 2600. It had a lot going for it, such as a 16-bit CPU, tons of buttons for more complex games, and, of course, the love of yours truly. Before you react, yes, I did say there was a 16-bit console in 1979, 9 years before the Mega Drive and 10 years before the North American version called Genesis. But don't think about it too much because the graphics, while beautiful for their time, aren't exactly Phantasy Star, even though both have roots in fantasy and role-playing. But back to AD&D. You might be surprised to know that this title actually went by a few different names. First, there was the working title of Adventure, like the 2600 title featured in the previous episode. The finished product was called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, naturally, and then when a sequel was released, it was rechristened AD&D Cloudy Mountain to distinguish it from the second game. More on that sequel, Treasure of Tarmin, in a future episode. It is, naturally, a fantasy-themed game rife with dungeons and, well, dragons. The dungeons are in caves and the dragons come in two varieties, wingless and at the end, winged. There is an overworld where you select your path, and honestly, if the map isn't procedurally generated, there are at least enough maps to fool you into thinking so. When I was 6 years old, it was thrilling to look at, I tell ya. Like most games of the day, there was a backstory, really just a paragraph expressing the backdrop for the game. Since cutscenes weren't invented yet, they were printed in the game manuals, but frankly, game designers weren't the best storytellers. This one holds up better than Adventures, though. But here, don't take it from me, Gandalf the Square will say it better than I ever could.
Your object is to acquire the two halves of the ancient crown of kings, hidden deep within the caverns of the legendary Cloudy Mountain. To reach the treasure, you must cross a hostile land. The obstacles are numerous. Your resources are courage, cunning, and 3 arrows. The rest you must find and fight to obtain. If you survive the wasteland and the creatures of the caves, you will have traveled out of danger into even greater peril. For each half of the Crown of Kings is guarded by terror. The winged dragons keep their endless watch.
I'd like to recap the game a little by contrasting it again with the only game released into mainstream video gaming that was comparable at the time, Adventure. After all, the comparison is unavoidable for anybody that's played both games. Adventure has the dungeons and the dragons, but the real deal AD&D has an overworld, and lots more dungeons and a real difference in how and why you deal with the dragons. There are more creatures in general, with giant spiders, which eat your arrows, demons, snakes, blobs, and bats. Really, both games had bats. AD&D had power-ups that allowed you to pass obstacles on the overworld, and getting them could make getting to the Cloudy Mountain faster, and not having them could make it impossible, depending on your map layout. When you descend into a mountain cave for the first time, it's important to note that you're probably going to die. This is because you have 3 arrows and probably a dozen monsters to kill. Fog of War hides them, and most of them are faster than you are. Sure, you can listen for audible cues from some of them, but the only way to take advantage of this is to fire into the darkness and hope you hit something. You can explore a whole dungeon without finding a quiver of arrows, so it comes down to the luck of the proverbial draw. Get up to 10 arrows, and you should run for the Cloudy Mountain as quick as you can, because there's no guarantee you'll find more, but you can certainly lose them. Sitting down to play the game and refamiliarize myself with all the reasons I loved it in the first place had a surprising side effect. Addiction. A lot of people complained about the Intellivision controllers and their plethora of buttons, but I never had a problem with it. Still don't. Before long I found myself bullseyeing the demons and dragons of every mountain, and finally, on what was probably my 100th attempt, I reunited the crown. And that was it. I honestly believe that the game would make a fine twin-stick shooter today if they sold it for 99 cents on Steam. It had depth, variety, and you could formulate a strategy based on what you saw on the overworld map. Nothing was handed to you, and therein lay the fun. My father bought me this game in 1982 for my 6th birthday, knowing that I'd enjoyed adventure, and we took turns figuring it out. It would still be 4 years before I stumbled across a copy of Dragon magazine in my middle school library and discovered that D&D was more than just a video game. Meanwhile, I gobbled up ever more fantasy, sci-fi too, just like those damned arrow-munching giant spiders. How about you? What was your first contact with the Dungeons & Dragons franchise? Have you played this game? And if so, what are your impressions? Anything else you can think of? Let me know in the comments section.